My name is Edith Davis, and at 36 years old, I thought I had secured my place at Morrison Financial Solutions after 6 dedicated years. That changed when I saw the holiday roster of executives authorized to close major deals. My name was missing. "You're off the Christmas roster, my VP." Richard smirked as he walked past my desk. He had no idea that decision would spectacularly backfire the very next week. Before I tell you how I turned this humiliating setback into my greatest triumph, let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button to support stories of workplace justice. When I joined Morrison Financial Solutions, I was just another ambitious college graduate with a finance degree and big dreams. I started in an entry-level position, spending long nights analyzing market trends and preparing reports that would often go unnoticed. But I was determined to climb the corporate ladder one exhausting rung at a time. My breakthrough came during my second year when James Wilson, then Executive Vice President, took notice of my detailed analysis of a potential client's financial structure. While others had presented the standard overview, I had identified a tax liability issue that could have derailed the deal months later. James pulled me aside after the meeting. "That was impressive work, Edith," he said, his eyes crinkling with a genuine smile. "Not many people would catch that discrepancy." From that moment, James became my mentor. He taught me the unwritten rules of corporate finance, how to navigate office politics, and most importantly, how to build relationships with clients that went beyond transactions to genuine trust. In this business, James would say, numbers matter, but people matter more. Anyone can crunch data, but not everyone can make a client feel heard. I took his advice to heart. Over the next 4 years, I moved from analyst to account manager to senior account executive. Each promotion came with more responsibility, but also with more recognition for my attention to detail and client relationship skills. By my 6th year, I had built a solid reputation and a portfolio of clients who specifically requested to work with me. One of the most coveted symbols of status at Morrison was the authorized signers roster. This wasn't just an administrative detail, it was a public acknowledgement of which executives were trusted to sign off on major deals without additional oversight. Being on this list meant you had earned the complete confidence of the company leadership. It meant freedom to move quickly when opportunities arose. It meant respect. The roster was updated at the end of each year just before our holiday break. Getting your name added was cause for celebration. Having it removed was a professional humiliation few recovered from. For the past 2 years, my name had been on that list, a fact I took considerable pride in. The most significant account in my portfolio was Apex Innovations, a rapidly growing tech company looking to expand internationally. Their CEO, David Mercer, and I had spent months structuring a $65 million financing package that would fund their European expansion. The deal was complex, with multiple funding sources, tax considerations across different countries, and intricate timing requirements. I had practically lived with this deal, often waking up in the middle of the night to jot down solutions to potential problems. David and I had developed a solid working relationship. He appreciated my thoroughness and how I anticipated his concerns before he voiced them. We were set to finalize everything right after New Year's, which would result in the largest commission of my career, enough to finally pay off my student loans and put a substantial down payment on a home of my own. Everything changed when James announced his retirement. His position was filled by Richard Evans, who had transferred from our West Coast office. From our first interaction, I sensed Richard viewed me differently than James had. Where James saw potential, Richard seemed to see competition. Where James offered guidance, Richard provided criticism. And where James had celebrated my successes publicly, Richard frequently took credit for my work in executive meetings. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's just establishing himself. I told my colleague Sarah Johnson during one of our coffee breaks. Sarah had been at Morrison even longer than I had, and she had seen this pattern before. "Be careful with Richard," she warned. I worked with him briefly during a cross-office project 3 years ago. He has a reputation for climbing over others to reach the top. I should have heeded her warning more carefully. Instead, I doubled down on proving my value. I worked longer hours, took on additional clients, and made sure every detail was perfect. I thought performance would protect me. I was wrong. The first real indication of trouble came during a presentation to the executive team about the Apex deal. I had prepared a comprehensive overview of the structure risks and projected returns. Richard interrupted me repeatedly, questioning details I had thoroughly vetted. "Are you certain about these growth projections?" he asked, his tone suggesting I had been careless. "They seem optimistic." "Yes, I'm certain," I replied calmly. "They're based on Apex's 3-year historical data adjusted for market conditions in each target country and validated against industry benchmarks. The detailed analysis is on page 43 of the appendix." He frowned slightly before moving on to his next challenge, but I noticed Teresa Alvarez, our CEO, giving me an approving nod. I thought I had successfully navigated Richard's attempt to undermine me. Again, I was wrong. As the year-end approached and the Apex deal moved toward closure, I became increasingly uneasy about Richard's interest in my work. He began requesting unnecessary updates and inserting himself into client calls. During one particularly tense meeting, he contradicted my explanation of a financing structure in front of David, creating confusion that took days to resolve. "What was that about?" David asked me privately afterward. "The structure we discussed last week made perfect sense, but Richard's version would increase our costs significantly." "There seems to be a misunderstanding," I said diplomatically, not wanting to air internal conflicts. "Let me clarify everything in writing so we're all on the same page." That night, I sent a detailed email to all parties clearly explaining the original structure and its benefits. Richard responded with a curt message. "We'll discuss this internally before proceeding." The warning bells were deafening now, but with the deal so close to completion and the year-end roster announcement approaching, all I could do was prepare my documentation meticulously and hope that results would speak for themselves. I had no idea just how dramatically things would unravel, or how an attempt to push me aside would ultimately give me the leverage to secure my position more firmly than ever before. The pre-holiday company meeting was held in our largest conference room, transformed for the occasion with tasteful decorations and a catered lunch. These year-end gatherings typically combined celebration with important announcements about the coming year's strategic focus, and of course the updated authorized signers roster. I arrived early, choosing a seat with a good view of the presentation screen. Sarah arrived shortly after, bringing us both coffee. "Ready for the roster announcement?" she asked, sliding into the chair beside me. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, trying to project confidence despite the knot in my stomach. The Apex deal alone should secure my position. The room gradually filled with colleagues in festive attire, the atmosphere buzzing with end-of-year energy. Teresa stood at the front, elegant in a tailored red suit, waiting for everyone to settle. Richard sat at her right hand, surveying the room like a king, assessing his court. After updates on company performance and recognition of top performers, during which my work on the Apex deal received only a passing mention, despite being the largest potential contract of the year, Teresa moved to the roster announcement. "As you know, our authorized signers represent Morrison's highest level of trust and responsibility." She began displaying the slide with the updated list. "These individuals have demonstrated exceptional judgment and expertise." My eyes immediately scanned for my name, starting at the top and working down. It wasn't there. I checked again, thinking I must have missed it. The third review confirmed the devastating truth. After 2 years, my name had been removed from the authorized signers roster. The shock must have shown on my face because Sarah squeezed my arm gently. "That can't be right," she whispered. I glanced across the room and caught Richard watching me, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. He nodded slightly, as if confirming that this was his doing. The remainder of the meeting passed in a blur. I maintained my professional composure through sheer force of will, nodding at appropriate moments and even contributing a comment when directly addressed. Inside, I was reeling, calculating what this meant for the Apex deal and my standing in the company. As soon as the meeting ended, I gathered my things and headed for the door, hoping to process this development privately before confronting Richard. He intercepted me in the hallway. Edith, a word, it wasn't really a question. He gestured toward an empty meeting room, and I followed, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Once the door closed, his pretense of collegiality dropped. I assume you noticed the roster change. I did, I replied neutrally. May I ask why my name was removed? Richard leaned against the table, exuding false sympathy. You're off the Christmas roster because frankly you're not ready for that level of responsibility. Not ready, I repeated, struggling to keep my voice even. I've successfully closed over 30 major deals in the past 2 years without a single issue. He waved his hand dismissively. The Apex deal requires a more experienced touch. I'll be taking over as primary contact effective immediately. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. You've been undermining me with David to position yourself to take over the account. Business is business, Edith. His tone hardened. Besides, I heard your ex Andrew at Westridge Financial has been reaching out to Apex. Perhaps your relationship with the client isn't as solid as you thought. The mention of Andrew, both my ex-boyfriend and a competitor at a rival firm, was a calculated blow. We had parted amicably when he took the position at Westridge, but Richard was implying something more sinister. You should focus on smaller accounts, he continued. Build your skills before aiming so high. I'm doing you a favor, really. A $65 million favor, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Exactly. Now I'll need all your Apex files transferred to me by end of day. The holiday party starts at 7. Try to put this behind you and enjoy yourself. After he left, I remained in the meeting room, processing what had just happened. This wasn't just about my name on a roster, it was about months of work, my professional reputation, and a client relationship I had carefully cultivated. More than that, it was about fairness and integrity. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah. I saw what happened, she said before I could speak. Richard cornered you after the meeting. He's taking over the Apex account, I said, still stunned by the brazenness of the move. He told me I should focus on smaller accounts while he handles the big fish. Sarah's sharp intake of breath conveyed her outrage. That's textbook discrimination. You should talk to HR. And say what I asked. That Richard doesn't think I'm experienced enough. Karen from HR is his golf buddy. They've been friends for years. Then what will you do? I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. First, I need to figure out how to handle the holiday party tonight. Everyone will know I've been taken off the roster and I refuse to give Richard the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. We'll go together, Sarah offered. Head high killer outfit, perfect makeup. Success is the best revenge. Despite my inner turmoil, I managed a small laugh. Thanks. After the party, I need to review exactly what legal authority I still have regarding Apex. There must be some way to protect the client relationship I've built. Hours later, I stood in the elegantly decorated hotel ballroom, where our holiday party was in full swing. As Sarah had suggested, I wore my best dress, a deep emerald, that complemented my auburn hair with makeup carefully applied to conceal the stress of the day. Colleagues offered polite conversation, but I could sense their awareness of my changed status. Some were genuinely sympathetic. Others seemed to be measuring the shifting power dynamics and recalculating their own allegiances. Across the room, Richard held court with several executives, including Teresa. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the animated gestures and occasional laughter suggested he was in his element. At one point, I distinctly saw him mime signing a document with a flourish, followed by appreciative nods from the group. He's talking about the Apex deal, Sarah whispered, appearing at my side with a fresh drink, basically taking credit for all your work already. I accepted the drink with a tight smile. Of course he is. I overheard Martin from accounting saying Richard convinced Teresa you weren't experienced enough to handle international financing on that scale, she continued. Apparently he had concerns about some of your projections. The familiar ache of injustice intensified. I had triple-checked those projections, even consulting with our international tax specialists. They were rock solid. I need some air, I said suddenly, finding the crowded room suffocating. On the terrace outside, the December air was bracingly cold. I welcomed it, using the chill to clear my head and cool my anger. Getting emotional wouldn't help me navigate this situation. I needed to be strategic. As I gazed at the city lights, a new resolve began to crystallize. Richard had underestimated me, assuming I would simply accept his power play. He didn't realize that in trying to take everything he had inadvertently freed me to fight without concern for conventional career preservation, when you have nothing left to lose, you discover what you're truly capable of. I returned to the party long enough to make a proper round of goodbyes, then headed home with a plan already forming. The holidays would give me time to prepare, and I intended to use every minute wisely. Richard thought he had won, but the game was far from over. The week between Christmas and New Year's usually moved at a languid pace, a time for family gatherings reflecting on the year past and planning for the one ahead. This year was different. While I made obligatory appearances at holiday events, my mind remained fixated on the Apex situation and how to address it professionally. The first Monday after the holiday break, I arrived at the office an hour early. My strategy was simple: maintain absolute professionalism, document everything, and look for any opportunity to protect both my reputation and the client's interests. Sarah met me in the break room, concern evident in her expression. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," I admitted, keeping my voice low despite the empty office. "But I'm not giving up. I spent the holidays reviewing every email, every contract draft, and every meeting note related to Apex. Find anything useful?" "Not yet," I said. "But I know this deal inside and out. Richard doesn't. That has to count for something." We were interrupted by the arrival of other colleagues, and conversation shifted to holiday stories and gift exchanges. I participated just enough to appear engaged while mentally rehearsing how to handle my first encounter with Richard since the roster announcement. I didn't have to wait long. At 9:30, my phone rang with a call from David Mercer at Apex. "Edith," he began without preamble, "I just received a strange email from Richard Evans saying he's taking over our account effective immediately. What's going on?" I chose my words carefully, aware that complaining about internal matters would be unprofessional. "There's been a reorganization of client assignments. Richard is now overseeing larger accounts, including Apex." "That's not acceptable," David said flatly. "We've worked with you for months on this structure. You understand our needs and have built the entire financing package around them." His direct support caught me by surprise. "I appreciate your confidence, David." "It's not about confidence, it's about continuity and competence. We're signing this deal next week. I need you in that room." "Officially, I'm no longer an authorized signer for deals of this magnitude," I explained, feeling a mix of gratitude for his support and frustration at my position. "Then get authorized," he said simply. "I'm calling Teresa this afternoon. In the meantime, I've replied to Richard that I expect you to be present at the signing. This isn't negotiable from our end." After we hung up, I sat motionless, processing this unexpected development. David's support was a powerful affirmation, but I knew Richard wouldn't surrender the deal easily. My office phone rang again. It was Richard. "I just received a concerning email from David Mercer," he began, his tone clipped. "Care to explain why he's insisting on your presence at the signing?" "I didn't speak with David until he called me 5 minutes ago," I replied truthfully. "He values the relationship we've built and the understanding I have of their business model." "Well, unreasonable client expectations need to be managed," Richard said dismissively. "I'll handle David. In the meantime, I still need those complete Apex files." "They're being prepared," I assured him, neglecting to mention I was organizing them to highlight the complex elements only I fully understood. After Richard hung up, Sarah appeared in my doorway. "From your expression, I'm guessing that wasn't a pleasant call." I filled her in on both conversations. "David's support is great, but it puts me in an awkward position. If Richard convinces Teresa that I'm undermining him with the client, it could make things worse. Or Sarah suggested it could force Teresa to recognize that client relationships matter more than Richard's ego. Either way, you need protection." She was right. That evening, I stayed late at the office reviewing company policies and procedures for deal authorizations. Most of it was familiar territory until I reached an older section about emergency authorizations that predated our current digital systems. Buried in the dense legal text was a provision I had never noticed before. In circumstances where an established client relationship is deemed essential to deal completion, temporary authorization may be granted to maintain relationship continuity subject to legal review. It wasn't much, but it was something a potential procedural foothold if David continued to insist on my involvement. I needed more information about how this provision had been used historically. On impulse, I called James, my retired mentor, hoping he might remember relevant precedents. "Edith," he answered warmly. "What a pleasant surprise. How are things at Morrison?" "Complicated," I admitted then, explained the situation with Richard and the roster removal. James listened without interrupting, then sighed heavily. "Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. Richard pulled similar moves in the West Coast office. It's why I argued against his promotion, but I was overruled. I found an old provision about temporary authorizations for relationship continuity," I said. "Do you know if it's ever been invoked?" "Twice that I recall," James confirmed. "Once during the financial crisis when a key executive was stranded overseas, and again when Linda Chen was on medical leave, but her client refused to work with anyone else. It's rarely used because it requires the client to specifically request the exception." "Which David has already done," I noted, feeling a spark of hope. "Document everything," James advised. "Every call, every email, every meeting. Richard will try to control the narrative, but facts are your best defense. And Edith, be careful. When Richard feels threatened, he becomes even more aggressive." After thanking James for his insight, I created a secure online folder with copies of all relevant Apex documents, including the historical provision about temporary authorizations. I then forwarded a carefully selected subset of files to Richard, comprehensive enough to meet his request, but structured to emphasize the complexities of the deal. The next day, Sarah and I met for lunch at a cafe, away from the office, to discuss strategy. "If David maintains his position about your involvement, and if Teresa values the deal enough, you might have leverage," Sarah reasoned as she stirred her soup. "That's a lot of ifs," I pointed out, "and Richard has Teresa's ear." "But Teresa cares about results above all else," Sarah countered. "The Apex deal is the largest of the quarter. If it's at risk because of Richard's ego, she'll prioritize closing successfully." I nodded slowly. "I need to be prepared for the signing meeting, whether I'm officially invited or not. David expects me there, and I won't let him down." We spent the afternoon preparing materials and anticipating potential challenges. I rehearsed responses to difficult questions and scenarios, determined to remain professional regardless of provocation. That evening, I received a terse email from Richard. "Your presence is requested at the Apex signing meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. main boardroom. Observe only." I forwarded it to Sarah with a simple message: "It's starting." When I finally returned home that night, I called my sister Lisa, who had always been my emotional anchor during difficult times. "You've got this," she assured me after listening to the situation. "You know the deal better than anyone. Just stay focused on what matters, serving the client's needs and maintaining your integrity." As I prepared for bed, I reviewed my strategy once more. I would enter that boardroom prepared for any contingency, with complete command of the details Richard had likely only skimmed. Whatever happened, I would conduct myself with the professionalism and expertise that had earned me my reputation. Richard might control the roster, but I still controlled my response to this challenge. And sometimes that makes all the difference. Morning arrived with a mixture of anticipation and dread. I dressed with particular care, choosing a conservative navy suit that projected authority without being flashy. Every detail mattered today, not just what I said, but how I presented myself. When I arrived at the office, the tension was palpable. Colleagues glanced at me with curious expressions, clearly aware that something significant was unfolding with the Apex deal. I maintained a calm exterior despite the butterflies in my stomach. At 8:45, I gathered my materials and headed toward the main boardroom. Sarah intercepted me in the hallway. Richard's been in Teresa's office for the past 20 minutes, she whispered. Looked intense. Thanks for the heads up, I replied. Any sign of the Apex team? They just arrived. Being escorted to the boardroom now. I took a steadying breath. Here we go. When I entered the boardroom, Richard was already there, arranging papers at the head of the table. He glanced up briefly, his expression hardening when he saw me. You can set up at the far end, he said, gesturing to the opposite side of the room. Remember, you're here as an observer only. I'll handle all discussions. I nodded politely and took my position, setting out my materials neatly. Minutes later, David and his team entered, accompanied by Michael Chen from our legal department. Edith, David said warmly, crossing the room to shake my hand. Good to see you. Likewise, I replied. I'm looking forward to finalizing our work together. Richard quickly inserted himself between us. David, we've prepared everything as discussed. Shall we get started? David glanced between us, his expression guarded. Where's the rest of your team? Particularly, where's the authorized signer for this deal? Richard's smile didn't waver, but I noticed his posture stiffen. As the Vice President of Strategic Accounts, I am fully authorized to execute this agreement. That's not what I asked, David said evenly. Our understanding was that Edith would be the authorized representative given her intimate knowledge of the structure. There's been a minor administrative adjustment, Richard explained smoothly. Edith is here to ensure continuity, but I'll be signing on behalf of Morrison. David frowned slightly before taking his seat. Let's proceed, but I want to note my concern about this last-minute change. The meeting began with Richard presenting an overview of the final agreement. Almost immediately, problems emerged. He mischaracterized several key provisions, referring to the European expansion as primarily targeting Western Europe when the focus was actually on emerging Eastern European markets. David's CFO, Linda Barnes, interrupted. That's not consistent with the projections we reviewed last month. The distribution of funds between markets has specific timing requirements due to regulatory variations. Richard faltered momentarily. Of course, that's what I meant to highlight, the variations in timing. David looked directly at me. Edith, would you clarify this point? Before I could respond, Richard interjected. I can address any concerns about the structure. With all due respect, David said firmly, I'd like to hear from Edith on this point. She developed the timing strategy with our team. All eyes turned to me. Richard's glare was venomous, but I maintained my composure. The distribution strategy accounts for regulatory approval timelines that vary by country, I explained. Poland and Romania require 60-day advance notices for foreign capital deployment, while Czech Republic has a 30-day window, but additional documentation requirements. The phased funding release in Section 4.3 is designed to optimize these variables. David nodded. That's exactly what we agreed to. Thank you for clarifying. The pattern continued as we moved through the agreement. Richard struggled with technical details while David increasingly directed his questions to me. The tension in the room escalated with each exchange. During a discussion about currency hedging strategies, Apex's legal counsel raised a concern about contingency provisions for exchange rate fluctuations above certain thresholds. The agreement addresses standard fluctuations, Richard stated confidently. But what about the supplemental protection we discussed for movements exceeding 5% in a 30-day period, the counsel pressed. That was a key protection given recent volatility. Richard shuffled through his papers. I don't see that provision. It must have been removed during final revisions as unnecessary. David's expression darkened. That provision wasn't optional. It was a core requirement given our board's risk tolerance parameters. Perhaps there's been a miscommunication, Richard suggested, his confident facade beginning to crack. There's been no miscommunication, David said firmly. Edith and I discussed this at length, and she drafted language that both protected our interests and maintained reasonable costs. It was in the version we approved last week. I knew exactly which document contained the provision in question. It had been in my final draft, which I had included in the files transferred to Richard. Either he had missed it, or worse, deliberately removed it, thinking it unnecessary. "May I asked, reaching for the contract. Richard hesitated before sliding it across to me. After a quick review, I confirmed my suspicion. The language appears to have been omitted from this version. However, I have the approved text right here. I retrieved the relevant document from my materials. Michael Chen, our legal counsel, reviewed both versions. The hedging provision was indeed in the version circulated last week. This appears to be an oversight in the final draft." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. David exchanged glances with his team before addressing Richard directly. "This is exactly why we wanted Edith leading this process. She understands our requirements and has consistently demonstrated attention to detail. These oversights could have cost us millions." Richard's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "These are minor details that can be easily addressed." $65 million isn't minor, David countered, and neither is our trust in our financial partners. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Richard became defensive, attempting to blame the omission on staff errors while simultaneously minimizing its importance. His contradictory explanations only further damaged his credibility with the Apex team. Finally, David stood up. "I think we need to take a step back. I'm not comfortable proceeding under these circumstances." Richard looked panicked. "We can make the necessary corrections and continue." "It's not just about corrections," David replied. "It's about confidence in who's managing our relationship. I'd like to speak with Teresa before we go any further." Richard's control of the situation was slipping away. "She's in meetings all morning. Perhaps we can reschedule." "I'll wait," David said firmly. "This deal is too important to rush through with unresolved concerns." Richard pulled out his phone and stepped outside the boardroom, presumably to call Teresa. The tension in his posture suggested the conversation wasn't going well. While he was gone, David approached me. "What's really going on here, Edith? Why was control of this account suddenly transferred?" I chose my words carefully. There was a reorganization of client assignments based on deal size. Unfortunately, the transition occurred during a critical phase of our work together. David studied me for a moment. "That's the diplomatic version, I assume." "Well, I've made my position clear to Richard, and I'll do the same with Teresa. We want you handling this deal." Richard returned, his expression grim. "Teresa is on her way. She'll be here in 15 minutes. The wait was excruciating. Richard paced near the door while David consulted quietly with his team. I remained at my seat reviewing my notes and gathering my thoughts for Teresa's arrival. When she finally entered, her expression was severe. "I understand there are some concerns about the agreement," she said, addressing the room at large. David stood to greet her. "Teresa, thank you for joining us. Yes, we've encountered some significant discrepancies between what we agreed to last week and what's presented in today's documents. Additionally, we're concerned about the sudden change in our relationship manager so close to closing." Teresa's gaze shifted between Richard, the Apex team, and me. "Richard, what's going on?" Richard launched into an explanation that minimized the issues while subtly attempting to shift blame. "There were some minor oversights in document preparation which we're addressing. As for the relationship management, I assumed greater supervision was appropriate given the deal size." "Supervision is one thing," David interjected. "Complete replacement is another. Edith has been instrumental in structuring this deal to meet our specific needs. The issues we're finding now suggest her involvement was more crucial than realized." Teresa turned to me. "Edith, what's your assessment of the situation?" All eyes were on me. This was the moment that would define not just the deal, but potentially my future at Morrison. I could either downplay the issues to protect Richard and the company's image, or I could be completely honest about what had transpired. I chose truth. The current contract draft is missing several key provisions that were in the version approved by both parties last week, I explained calmly. The most significant is the currency hedging protection that Apex specifically requested. Additionally, there are mischaracterizations of market priorities and timing requirements that could affect implementation. Teresa's expression remained neutral. but I could see her processing the implications. And how did these discrepancies occur? I can't speak to that directly, I replied. I transferred complete and accurate files as requested, but I wasn't involved in preparing today's documents. The moment hung in the air heavy with unspoken accusations and potential consequences. We had reached the tipping point where the situation could resolve in any number of ways, and not all of them in my favor, despite the facts on my side. What happened next would depend on Teresa's priorities, preserving hierarchy or preserving the deal. Teresa surveyed the room with the measured calm that had made her a successful CEO. Let's take a step back and address this methodically. Michael, as our legal counsel, please give me your assessment of the contract discrepancies. Michael Chen adjusted his glasses, his expression serious. I've reviewed both the previously approved version and today's draft. There are indeed substantial differences that go beyond clerical errors. The currency hedging provision is completely absent, and several other key terms have been altered in ways that shift risk from Morrison to Apex. Richard immediately went on the defensive. Those changes were made to protect our position. Some of the provisions Edith included were unnecessarily favorable to Apex. That's simply not true, David countered. The terms we negotiated were balanced and reflected the partnership approach we believed we were building with Morrison. The tension in the boardroom was palpable as Teresa processed this information. She turned to me next. Edith, you structured this deal from the beginning. In your professional opinion, are the original terms you negotiated fair and appropriate for both parties? Yes, I replied confidently. Each provision was carefully balanced to protect both companies while facilitating Apex's expansion goals. The terms reflect industry standards for deals of this nature, adjusted for the specific risks of the Eastern European markets they're entering. Teresa nodded, then addressed Richard. Why was Edith removed from the authorized signers roster when she clearly has the most intimate knowledge of this deal? Richard shifted uncomfortably. As I explained previously, I felt deals of this magnitude required more experienced oversight. This is a $65 million international financing package, our largest this quarter. Which is precisely why continuity of representation matters, David interjected. Changing key personnel days before signing introduces unnecessary risks, as today has unfortunately demonstrated. Teresa's expression remained unreadable as she considered the situation. Michael, is there anything in our policies regarding continuity of client relationships in large deals? This was the moment I had been waiting for. Michael began thumbing through a policy binder, but I was prepared. If I may, I said, retrieving a document from my folder. There is a specific provision in our operational guidelines. I handed the page to Michael, who reviewed it briefly before passing it to Teresa. She's correct, Michael confirmed. Section 12.7 states that, in circumstances where an established client relationship is deemed essential to deal completion, temporary authorization may be granted to maintain relationship continuity subject to legal review. Teresa studied the provision, then looked up at the room. This seems directly applicable to our current situation. Richard's face flushed with anger. That's an obscure clause that's rarely invoked. It's clearly an attempt to circumvent the proper chain of authority. Actually, Michael said, his tone carefully neutral. This provision exists specifically for situations where rigid adherence to hierarchy might jeopardize client relationships and deal completion. It's a safeguard, not a loophole. David leaned forward, his expression resolute. Teresa, I want to be absolutely clear. Apex wants to work with Morrison, but we want Edith to handle this deal. She understands our business model, our expansion goals, and the intricate tax and regulatory considerations across multiple countries. The trust we've built with her is a key factor in our decision to partner with Morrison in the first place. Teresa was silent for a long moment, weighing the complex factors at play. Finally, she addressed the room. I need to review something in the contract. Michael, can you point me to the section regarding signatures and authorizations? Michael flipped to the relevant page and pointed out a specific clause. Teresa read it carefully, then looked up, her expression grave. This clause states that any material changes to authorized representatives must be communicated in writing at least 14 business days before execution with acknowledgement from both parties, she said, her voice taking on a new edge. Richard, was Apex notified in writing when you took over the account? Richard swallowed visibly. I sent David an email last week. 6 days ago, David corrected, and we immediately responded with our concerns, which were apparently ignored. Teresa's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing genuine alarm. So we're in breach of our own contract terms before we've even signed. Michael cleared his throat uncomfortably. That would appear to be the case. Additionally, there's another consideration. He hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. Go on, Teresa prompted. The international banking regulations for deals exceeding $50 million require certification that the signing authority has been substantively involved in structuring the transaction, Michael explained. It's an anti-fraud measure implemented after the financial crisis. Given that Richard has only been involved for less than 2 weeks. Teresa closed her eyes briefly, as though physically pained by this information. When she opened them, her decision was evident. Michael, please read aloud the exact language of that regulatory requirement. Michael adjusted his glasses and read from a legal reference document. For cross-border financing exceeding 50 million USD equivalent, the authorized signatory must certify their substantive participation in transaction structuring and their comprehensive understanding of all material terms, with documentation of such participation maintained for regulatory review. The boardroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Richard couldn't truthfully make such a certification, and falsifying it would expose both him and Morrison to severe regulatory penalties. Teresa's face had gone pale. She turned to Richard, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. Did you review this regulatory requirement before removing Edith from the roster? Richard's silence was answer enough. Teresa took a deep breath, visibly collecting herself. David, I apologize for this confusion. It appears we have a procedural issue that needs immediate correction. She turned to me. Edith, pursuant to Section 12.7 of our operational guidelines, I am granting you temporary authorization to continue representing Morrison in this transaction. Michael will document this exception accordingly. Richard stood abruptly. This is completely inappropriate. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Accounts. This undermines my authority and… Teresa cut him off sharply. This isn't about authority. It's about regulatory compliance and client service. We'll discuss this privately later. For now, please provide Edith with any materials she needs to proceed. The shift in power was dramatic and immediate. Richard's face cycled through shock, anger, and humiliation before settling into a rigid mask of professional restraint. Without another word, he gathered his personal items and left the boardroom. Teresa addressed the Apex team. I apologize for the confusion and any concern it may have caused. Edith will continue as your primary contact with my full confidence and authorization. Michael will work with her to ensure all contract terms are restored to their approved versions before we reconvene. David's relief was evident. Thank you, Teresa. We value our relationship with Morrison and appreciate your responsiveness to our concerns. As the meeting adjourned for a 2-hour recess while documents were corrected, Teresa gestured for me to join her in her office. Once the door closed behind us, she sank into her chair with a sigh. Tell me exactly what happened, she said, and don't edit for politics. I provided a concise but comprehensive account of the events leading up to today, from Richard's gradual interference with the Apex relationship to the roster removal and the discovery of the critical provisions. Teresa listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled. When I finished, she nodded slowly. I owe you an apology, Edith. I accepted Richard's assessment of the situation without adequate verification. That was a significant lapse in judgment on my part. You made decisions based on the information you had, I replied diplomatically. That's generous of you, but it doesn't excuse my failure to dig deeper, she said. especially given Richard's history of similar behavior in the West Coast office, which I was aware of but discounted. She paused, studying me thoughtfully. James Wilson always spoke highly of you. I should have remembered that when evaluating Richard's concerns. The mention of my mentor brought a small smile to my face. James taught me to prioritize client relationships and attention to detail above office politics. Lessons Richard clearly never learned, Teresa observed dryly. Well, you've certainly demonstrated both today, not to mention considerable grace under pressure. Thank you, I said, simply knowing that excessive modesty would be as inappropriate as boasting in this moment. Let's get this deal back on track, Teresa said, standing up. And afterward, we'll have a more extensive conversation about your role at Morrison moving forward. 2 hours later, the corrected agreements were ready. The signing meeting reconvened with a noticeably different atmosphere. Richard was absent, and Teresa herself joined to observe the proceedings. As I guided the Apex team through the restored provisions confirming each critical element had been properly reinstated, I felt a profound sense of vindication. Not triumph over Richard, that would be petty, but vindication of my professional standards and the relationship of trust I had built with David and his team. When it came time for signatures, I signed each document with steady hands and clear conscience, knowing that every term reflected the careful balance of interests that had been negotiated over months of diligent work. David signed the final page and offered his hand. This is what partnership looks like, he said, with a meaningful glance at Teresa. We look forward to a long and productive relationship with Morrison, especially with you, Edith, guiding the implementation. As we gathered our materials and prepared to depart, I caught Teresa watching me with an appraising expression. Whatever came next, I knew that today had marked a turning point, not just for the Apex deal, but for my career and the culture at Morrison. The authorized signers roster suddenly seemed like a very small thing compared to what really mattered: integrity, competence, and the courage to stand up for both when challenged. The hours following the Apex signing passed in a blur of congratulations, paperwork processing, and quiet conversations among colleagues who had heard pieces of what transpired in the boardroom. By late afternoon, I found myself back in Teresa's office for the discussion she had promised. Close the door, she said as I entered. Her expression was serious but not severe. First, let me officially congratulate you on successfully closing the Apex deal. $65 million is significant by any measure and particularly impressive given the circumstances. Thank you, I replied, taking the offered seat across from her desk. It's a relief to have everything properly executed. Teresa nodded. Now we need to address what happened with Richard and how we move forward. She folded her hands on her desk. Richard is being removed from his position, effective immediately. Though I had suspected consequences would be serious, the swiftness and finality of the decision surprised me. I see. His actions created significant legal exposure for Morrison, Teresa continued. Not just the contract breach, but potential regulatory violations that could have resulted in substantial penalties and reputational damage. Add to that his deliberate undermining of a key client relationship and misrepresentations to executive leadership. She shook her head. It's untenable. What happens to his accounts? I asked, the practical implications immediately coming to mind. That's part of what I wanted to discuss with you, Teresa said. I'm creating a new position, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, focusing on our international portfolio. Given your demonstrated expertise with complex cross-border financing and your skill in building client relationships, I'd like to offer you the role. The offer caught me completely off guard. I had hoped for restoration of my position on the authorized signers roster, perhaps an acknowledgement of my work on the Apex deal. This was far more than I had anticipated. That's a significant promotion, I managed, trying to collect my thoughts. It's warranted, Teresa said simply. Today made clear that we need to reconsider how we structure our senior leadership. Richard was promoted based on traditional metrics that failed to capture what truly matters in our business: deep knowledge, attention to detail, and genuine client relationship building. You exemplify those qualities. Thank you, I said, genuinely moved by her assessment. I would be honored to accept the position. Excellent. Teresa smiled for the first time. There will be formal announcements next week, but you can begin transition planning immediately. I'd like you to review the entire international portfolio and assess which relationships need immediate attention. What about the authorized signers roster? I asked. Consider that policy under review, Teresa replied. Michael is already working on a revised authorization framework that focuses more on expertise and client continuity than arbitrary hierarchical considerations. In the meantime, you're fully reinstated with expanded authority appropriate to your new position. As our meeting concluded, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, vindication certainly, but also a sobering awareness of the responsibility I was taking on. This wasn't just about winning a power struggle. It was about reshaping how Morrison approached client relationships and deal management. When I returned to my office, Sarah was waiting, barely containing her curiosity. Well, what happened after the signing? The rumor mill is going crazy. I closed the door before responding. Richard is out. I've been offered Vice President of Strategic Partnerships overseeing our international portfolio. Sarah's eyes widened. That's huge. Congratulations. She hesitated, studying my expression. You don't seem as thrilled as I expected. It's been an intense day, I admitted. I'm excited about the opportunity, but also thinking about the implications. This isn't how I wanted to advance. You didn't create this situation, Sarah reminded me gently. Richard did that all on his own. You simply handled it with integrity and professionalism. She was right, of course. I hadn't sought out this confrontation or schemed for Richard's position. I had simply stood my ground when pushed into an untenable situation, protecting both my client's interests and my own professional standards. Later that day, David called to formally confirm Apex's commitment to expanding our relationship beyond the initial financing package. Your handling of today's challenges confirmed we made the right choice in partnering with Morrison, specifically with you, he said. We'd like to discuss additional services for our Asian expansion planning next quarter. I'd be delighted to explore that with you, I replied, making notes for follow-up. And David, thank you for your support today. It made a significant difference. I recognize talent and integrity when I see it, he said simply. Both are rarer than they should be in this industry. After work, I called my sister Lisa to share the news of my promotion. Her immediate joy and pride were exactly what I needed after such an emotionally draining day. I knew you wouldn't let that jerk get away with it, she crowed. Vice President Edith. I like the sound of that. It still doesn't feel quite real, I confessed. This morning I was fighting to stay involved with my client. Now I'm responsible for our entire international strategy. Because you proved you could handle it, Lisa said confidently. Under the most stressful circumstances possible, you kept your cool and demonstrated exactly why you deserved that role. I'm so proud of you, sis. Her unwavering support helped ground me as I processed the day's events. We chatted about practical considerations, the likely increase in travel with my new position, potential office relocation, closer to the executive suite, plans to celebrate properly over the weekend. The next day brought a flurry of activity as news of Richard's departure spread throughout the company. Karen from HR, who I had once considered Richard's ally, requested a meeting to discuss the transition. I want to apologize, she said, when we met, surprising me with her directness. I should have been more attentive to the warning signs with Richard. His personnel file from the West Coast office contained several concerning incidents that I didn't sufficiently investigate. We all missed signals, I acknowledged, choosing generosity over recrimination. Moving forward would require building bridges, not burning them. Over the following days, I immersed myself in learning about the full scope of our international portfolio. Teresa arranged for me to meet with each department head to understand their perspectives on our global strategy, and I spent evenings reviewing client histories and market analyses. By the end of the week, Richard had cleared out his office and left without goodbyes. I heard through the grapevine that he had taken a position with a smaller firm, a significant step down from his role at Morrison. While I took no pleasure in his downfall, there was a certain poetic justice in the outcome. The following Monday, Teresa made the formal announcement of my promotion at the company-wide meeting. The applause seemed genuine, and numerous colleagues stopped by afterward to offer congratulations. Edith James Wilson called that evening. "I just heard the news from Teresa. I couldn't be prouder if you were my own daughter. I couldn't have navigated this without your mentorship," I told him sincerely. "The principles you taught me were my guideposts through this whole situation." "You did the hard part," he countered. "Standing your ground when it would have been easier to step aside takes real courage. Not everyone has that, regardless of their technical skills or experience." His words stayed with me as I settled into my new role. The promotion brought challenges, certainly longer hours, more complex decisions, greater scrutiny of my work, but it also brought opportunities to shape Morrison's approach to international business in ways that emphasized relationship building and ethical practice over short-term gains. 1 month after the Apex signing, Teresa invited me to lunch to check on my transition. "How are you settling in?" she asked once we were seated. "It's been a steep learning curve," I admitted, "but an exciting one. I've already identified several relationships that need attention and opportunities we've been missing in emerging markets." Teresa nodded approvingly. "The feedback I'm getting is universally positive. Clients appreciate your thoughtful approach, and the team responds well to your leadership style." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "What happened with Richard was unfortunate but ultimately clarifying. It forced us to recognize patterns we had been ignoring and to reevaluate what leadership really means at Morrison." "I've been thinking about that too," I said. "About how organizations sometimes confuse confidence with competence or mistake aggression for ambition." "Precisely," Teresa agreed, "which is why I'd like your input on our revised authorized signers policy. Michael has drafted something that emphasizes demonstrated expertise and relationship continuity, but I'd value your perspective given your recent experience." The request represented more than just administrative input. It was an acknowledgement that my voice mattered in reshaping company culture. As we discussed the policy implications, I felt a profound sense of professional fulfillment, knowing that my difficult experience might prevent similar situations for others in the future. When I returned to the office after lunch, I found Sarah waiting with a small gift bag. "A token to celebrate your 1-month anniversary as VP," she explained with a smile. Inside was a beautiful pen engraved with a simple message, "Integrity signs here." The thoughtful gift brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched, "for this and for standing by me through everything." "Always," Sarah replied simply. "That's what friends do." As I placed the pen on my desk, I reflected on the journey of the past month, from exclusion to leadership, from uncertainty to confidence. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led me to exactly where I needed to be. Sometimes I realize being taken off the roster is just the beginning of a much more important story. 1 year after the infamous Apex signing, I stood at the podium during Morrison's annual leadership conference, preparing to present our international growth strategy. The audience included executives from all our offices worldwide, including many who had witnessed my journey from being removed from the authorized signers roster to becoming Vice President of Strategic Partnerships. Looking out at their attentive faces, I felt a moment of quiet gratification. The past year had brought significant changes, both professional and personal, all stemming from that pivotal confrontation in the boardroom. The most immediate and visible change had been Richard's departure. After leaving Morrison, he had struggled to establish himself at the smaller firm and eventually left the industry altogether. I took no pleasure in his professional difficulties, understanding that his approach had likely been shaped by his own experiences and insecurities. The real victory wasn't his downfall, but the systemic improvements his actions had inadvertently triggered. Under Teresa's leadership, and with my active involvement, Morrison had completely restructured its authorization policies. The new framework emphasized subject matter expertise and relationship continuity over hierarchical position, with clear documentation requirements and client input considerations. The changes had already prevented several potential issues, by ensuring the right people remained involved with accounts regardless of internal reorganizations. Beyond policy changes, we had implemented a formal mentorship program specifically designed to support women in finance. The program paired promising professionals with experienced executives who could provide guidance on navigating both technical challenges and office politics. Sarah had recently been promoted to lead this initiative, bringing her natural talent for relationship building to a role with organization-wide impact. My personal growth had been equally significant. The crisis had forced me to advocate for myself in ways I might have otherwise avoided, pushing me beyond my comfort zone and revealing strengths I hadn't fully recognized. I had learned to trust my expertise and stand firm in my convictions even when facing powerful opposition. The experience had also taught me valuable lessons about documentation. I now maintained meticulous records of all client interactions and key decisions, not from paranoia, but as a best practice that protected everyone's interests. This habit had proven invaluable during regulatory reviews and when onboarding new team members to complex accounts. Perhaps most importantly, I had developed a deeper understanding of leadership. True leadership wasn't about titles or signing authority. It was about taking responsibility, maintaining integrity, and putting client relationships above ego. These principles now guided my management approach and the culture I worked to foster within my team. The Apex relationship had flourished under this philosophy. What began as a $65 million financing package had expanded to include treasury management services, acquisition financing, and strategic advisory work across multiple regions. David frequently cited our partnership as a model for his other financial relationships, and we were currently exploring innovative financing structures for their planned expansion into Southeast Asia. As my presentation concluded and I fielded questions from colleagues, I noticed James Wilson sitting in the back row. Though retired, he occasionally attended key events, and his presence today felt particularly meaningful. His mentorship had provided the foundation for my professional ethics, and his early confidence in my abilities had helped me believe in myself during the darkest moments of the Richard conflict. After the session, James approached with his characteristic warm smile. "Masterful presentation, Edith. You've taken everything I taught you and improved upon it substantially." "I had an excellent teacher," I replied genuinely, touched by his ongoing support. "Teachers can only point the way," he said wisely. "The journey is made by the student. Speaking of which, I hear you're mentoring several promising associates now." I nodded. 5 currently, including 2 women who remind me of myself a decade ago. Brilliant but sometimes hesitant to claim their expertise. I'm trying to help them find their voice earlier than I found mine. "That may be your most important work," James observed. "Transforming systems happens one relationship at a time." His comment resonated deeply with my evolving understanding of professional legacy. While the Apex deal and my subsequent promotion had been personally significant, the lasting impact would come through changing how business was conducted and helping others navigate challenges I had faced. That evening, Morrison hosted a dinner to celebrate our most successful client partnerships of the year. The Apex team was prominently featured, and David made a point of acknowledging our journey together. "A year ago, we nearly walked away from this relationship due to a breakdown in trust," he said candidly during his remarks. "What saved it was one person's unwavering commitment to doing things right even when it would have been easier to step aside." Edith demonstrated that integrity and expertise ultimately matter more than titles or hierarchies, a lesson both our organizations have benefited from embracing. His public recognition brought a round of applause that felt like the final closure on a chapter that had once seemed potentially career-ending. As I acknowledged the tribute with a modest nod, I caught Teresa's approving glance from across the room. She had taken a significant risk backing me against Richard, and the results had vindicated her decision many times over. Later that night, as I drove home, reflecting on the day's events, I called my sister Lisa, who had been my emotional anchor throughout the entire journey. "So, Vice President Davis, another successful conference," she teased gently. "It went well," I admitted. "Sometimes I still can't quite believe how everything turned out." "I can," Lisa said confidently. "You always had this in you." It just took a crisis to bring it to the surface. That's the strange part, I mused. If Richard hadn't tried to push me aside, I might have continued on the same path for years, never discovering what I was truly capable of. The universe has a funny way of putting obstacles in our path that turn out to be doorways, Lisa observed, with characteristic insight. Her comment captured perfectly what I had come to understand about adversity. The moments that test us most severely are often the ones that reveal our true capacity. Being removed from the roster had felt like professional humiliation at the time, but it had ultimately been the catalyst for profound growth and opportunity. As I settled into my home that evening, I noticed the framed photo on my mantel, a group shot from the international team retreat I had organized 6 months earlier. The diverse faces of my colleagues smiled back at me, a visual representation of the collaborative culture we were building together. Beside it stood a small crystal deal toy commemorating the apex, signing a common industry memento that in this case held uncommon significance. It reminded me daily that standing up for what's right, even when difficult, even when frightening, is always the right choice, professionally and personally. The journey from that confrontational boardroom to my current position had taught me that true security doesn't come from titles or rosters, but from knowing your value and maintaining your integrity. No one can take those away unless you surrender them willingly. For professionals navigating similar challenges, I would offer this hard-won wisdom document: meticulously know your value, build genuine relationships, and when pushed to compromise your standards, find the courage to stand firm. The short-term discomfort of confrontation is nothing compared to the lasting damage of sacrificing your professional integrity. Most importantly, remember that setbacks, even painful ones, often contain hidden opportunities for growth and redirection. What initially feels like rejection may actually be redirection toward a path better aligned with your true capabilities and values. Have you ever faced a professional setback that ultimately led to unexpected growth? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this account of my journey from roster rejection to executive leadership resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might be facing similar challenges in their careers. Remember that your greatest professional triumphs may be waiting just on the other side of your most difficult moments. Thank you for joining me today, and may you find the courage to stand firm when it matters most.